I want to talk about the fact that there are inherent risks and limitations of the current AI that's available for public use, like ChatGPT. A lot of these are well known, and so because they are well known or you can educate yourself on them, you can actually take that into consideration when you are using the tools and you can mitigate them. So I want to show you a few examples that I've been playing with recently. So I'm actually looking into starting a podcast about AI for helpers. I'm looking at different names. I was using ChatGPT to help me brainstorm different possible names and taglines for this podcast. But the next part that I was interested in was, okay, I want to know, all these great ideas for the podcast, but I'm also still in the development phase. So I'm wondering, is this even a good idea? Are there potential things I'm not thinking about? Because I tend to be an optimist. I tend to always be positive and, excited about new technology. And so it's easy for me to come up with a list of like all the cool things that are going on and how can I talk about it? But I'm not always the person who can think about all of the cynical things or all of the scary things or risks. And what I've learned when you're using ChatGPT is that ChatGPT wants to help you. The way that it's been programmed, it's generally going to give you positive responses. And like if you ask it, how does this look? Is this a good idea? It's usually going to affirm you and say, wow, that's a great idea. And, you keep going. In fact, some people like the fact that it's really great at giving you positive reinforcement and atta girls. And, it really is quite enthusiastic about everything that you're doing. And that's part of it, trying to be a helpful tool that will make people feel like it's there to support them and not to, challenge them. So if you want it to challenge you and you want to actually get those, counterpoints to what you're doing, you have to ask it directly. So I had been using it just to do the brainstorming, but then I said to ChatGPT, I want to be prepared for any negative feedback or blowback from publishing this podcast. What would possible criticisms of this show? What might people say who don't agree with it? So notice that I wasn't like, what do you not like about this idea, ChatGPT? Because that probably wouldn't get me as far because ChatGPT's own programming is aimed to make it affirming. And so instead, I was like, I know you love the show. You're definitely on my side. But let's pretend for a second that there are those people out there who don't like the show or that have a negative opinion of this. What might they say about it? And that worked really well. So they came up with a whole list: technological cynicism, privacy, economic complexity, ethics, resistance to change, dependency. Most of these were things I had already thought about, but a couple of them I hadn't. So it was really great. And then they also just talked about, um, how people might react in a more narrative way. But I love, you can see that the ChatGPT really wants to support you. And so it always ends on a positive note that says, always remember the guiding principles of Do Good, Be Good, which is my company, and you'll be in a strong position to address any criticism that comes your way. So that kind of shows you exactly what I was talking about, is it'll do what I'm asking it to, which is to tell me the criticism, but it still wants to affirm me and give me that positive reinforcement, which honestly I'm fine with. That's nice. You just have to know that about it and prepare it. So then I asked it also, I'm designing an episode specifically about the risks of AI and the possible rewards to foster families. So I had it help me brainstorm what some of the risks were. Again, a lot of these were things I had already thought about, but it's kind of nice to just check your own thinking to see, is there anything I didn't think about? And that's one way I really find ChatGPT to be a helpful assistant, is just continuing the brainstorming that I'm already doing. Okay, you may be asking yourself, oh, how did it know that you worked for a company called Do Good, Be Good? And that's because one of the most important things, if you have ChatGPT and you're using it regularly for your work or for a specific purpose, is to get used to the fact that they now have custom instructions. So that's under the settings. You can go to custom instructions. And I have told it that I am running a company called Do Good, Be Good. And I can also tell it more about my operating principles, which is why it referred to my operating principles. So I let it know, like, these are the things I care about: supporting the best of humanity, creating spaces for people to be good humans, modeling learning, things like that. Now, it has come to quote those things back to me a lot. And so I have been experimenting with ways to get it to embody those ideas without actually just quoting them all the time. And I'm experimenting with ways to do that. The other thing that you can tell it is how you like it to respond to you in terms of the writing style. I'm talking about friendly but informal, still professional, not using slang, things like that. I also have a strong value. I identify as queer myself. It's important to me that my writing is always going to be supportive of the LGBTQ plus community, so I put it in there. Interestingly, I put in I don't want any humor about gender. I recently had a picture that was saying, men need to get their paint colors approved by their wives. And I took that picture of this sign that was at the local hardware store. And I thought it was, a little offensive in my view. Kind of funny, but also one of those, oh my gosh, this is an old joke. And so I added it to ChatGPT because I have the paid version. I can use images. And I said, can you create a meme based on this? And it wouldn't do it, or at least it said, we don't laugh about gender. We don't create humor about gender. It's not aligned with what we're about. And I was like, oh, it's actually using the custom instructions. That's great. So the other thing you can do is if you're doing search engine optimization, you can add in, here are the keywords I want you to write into any blog posts or website copy that we're doing. Make sure that you're using words that will resonate with your audience. So those are just some examples of how you can use the custom instructions to make sure that it doesn't do one of the other things that's a big risk and downfall of using ChatGPT is that it just writes in a way that's not consistent with how you would want to write. Suddenly you're trying to use it for things and you're like, well, that doesn't sound like me anymore. Maybe it's really bringing in someone else's voice because it's scraping from the whole internet and you're worried about it seeming like you're copying someone else. All of these things are real problems of using ChatGPT. And this is one way you can mitigate that is by educating it on this is what I'm about, this is how I like to talk, this is my style. And then you're using it more as a writing assistant to write like you write rather than to copy other people's writing. I was recently in a training which was letting people know how to do SEO for business. And they immediately started with, write this website like you are this celebrity. And I think that's a real risk of using ChatGPT is to use that as a crutch to say, write in the style of this person. When you're developing your own story, your own messages, you really want to get better at developing your story, your messages, finding your voice. So using ChatGPT to assist you in that is more useful than doing the crutch of like, write like someone who writes more interestingly than I do. Trust me, I'm tempted to do it as well, and I have played with it just to see how it works, but it is a real potential problem area, and this is a great way to help avoid that. One of the things I'm most excited about ChatGPT and other AI tools for is the way that it can hopefully make our world more accessible and give more access to people with disabilities, for people who have different, um, you know, languages that they speak as their first language. So I think that we could really use the tools to help us to modify our writing and the things that we're creating to make sure that they're accessible. Because a lot of times you want to be accessible, but you don't necessarily know how to write for the web in a way that's accessible. So that's one thing I was asking is if I'm updating my website, which I have on WordPress, I said, hey, what do I need to consider when making it accessible? And ChatGPT is able to pull in some helpful suggestions about everything from color contrast to, for example, alt text for images. I want to highlight alt text for images for a second because actually my very first job was working on a nonprofit for people who are visually impaired. And so I learned about all of the features that go into making things accessible for people with visual impairment. And a big one is giving what that's called alt text for images, which is anytime you put an image on a blog or a website or really anything where it's going to be on the internet, you're asked, what's the alt text? And sometimes people just skip that because either they don't know what that means or they don't know how to write it. And I'll admit, even knowing what it means, I have sometimes skipped it because I'm in a hurry and I don't take the time to write it down. But alt text is basically alternative text for describing the image. And that is really important because if someone is using a screen reading software, the screen reading software will describe the image using that alt text so that someone who's doing that and needs that accessibility feature gets the same experience and understands what the images are. A lot of times you're using images to convey important information, so you don't want to miss the chance to have someone using that software know. So here's an example. If you have the paid version, currently it's only available in the paid version, but things are changing all the time, so this could be available in the free version before long. You can add images in your chat to ChatGPT. I've named my ChatGPT Tegan, by the way, which is why I say, hi, Tegan. And I say, I need a verbal description of the image to put in the alt text on a website. Can you do that? So, like I said, ChatGPT is very affirming, certainly. And then they give this long description. Now, this is a great example of why I sometimes skip alt text, because I know that good alt text is very descriptive. It goes into this level of detail, and I usually don't take the time to do that. So even if I've done alt text, I've usually done something really basic like level up your recruitment on this date. I just give the information rather than truly describing the image the way you're supposed to give someone that inclusive experience. So this is one thing I'm going to be doing as housekeeping, digital housekeeping, is using ChatGPT to go back in and do proper alt text for all of my images on my website and blog and update them with that. Now, this is great for accessibility. It also helps to make sure that your website is getting the best ranking on Google and is more findable because this shows that your website is using best practices. It will be ranked higher. If you're updating it, it shows that you're keeping it up to date. And it also has those words in it, like AmeriCorps logo. Well, AmeriCorps is one of my keywords, so that's going to help me in keyword ranking as well. So it's a really great thing to do to be inclusive, but also to help your website. And I mentioned, my whole theme of today's video is about sort of mitigating the risks and the potential pitfalls of AI and ChatGPT. And that's one reason I bring up inclusion in this space, because one thing we know about ChatGPT is that although it's a machine and you might think it's unbiased, because it's created and programmed by humans, it does have the natural, or not natural, but the existing biases that are already present in our society get baked into the programming. So you really have to think about, how do we use this to overcome some of those current problems we have with not being as inclusive? So this is one way we can be more inclusive through the use of ChatGPT. I'm going to show you another one in just a sec. So in addition to being inclusive by things like making sure custom instructions encourages inclusion, by using it to make your existing assets more inclusive, you can also use it to give it specific instructions, letting it know what you're looking for. So like I said, I'm starting a podcast, and so I was asking it to give me a outline for what I need to include in a pitch deck about my podcast. Now, the first job that it did at this, it did a very standard pitch deck. It's like, here's about me, here's my company, here's what the podcast is about. And then I was reading this great book by Nancy Duarte called Resonate. Yes, a physical book. And she was talking about how this style of doing a presentation is very boring, and it makes it all about you. It's very tech bro, very not focused on storytelling or about centering the person you're trying to serve as the hero. So I thought, oh, yeah, that's true. If I just go with the default that it gives me, that's going to be a trap that I'm going to fall into, because it does tend to give you sort of the basic answer. It's always going to give you sort of the most standard answer first, or the most basic majority answer first. And sometimes you want to stand out, or you want to be different, or you want to highlight a different style or different culture. And that's not necessarily what it's going to give you first, but you can ask for it. So I said, actually, let's revisit this. This is very me focused. Can you present an alternative inspired by StoryBrand and the Resonate work from Nancy Duarte that would refocus my audience as the hero? So now it gives me this slide framework, and this is just the outline of like what to put when. So it gives me an outline to work from. And you can see it's completely changed it around so that now I'm focusing on what's the problem, who's the hero, who's the audience, how will I help that person, and how will it go? So it did a great job with that prompt of refocusing it. Now I'll show you one more. Okay, my last piece of this, and I will admit that I'm going to look into potential risks of uploading a piece of copywritten material into ChatGPT. I do have to check on whether that can create problems, but this is just one paragraph that when I was reading the book, I was like, wow, this really is something I want to dive into more. So I used the ChatGPT app on my phone, and I took a picture of just that paragraph, and then I asked it, actually, I didn't even ask it to transcribe it, but it did that as a default because it didn't know what I wanted it to do. So it transcribed it for me into text here. And then I said, can you suggest anything else I can read that would talk about the same concepts? So again, I use it like an assistant. I want to use its ability to research online, its ability to condense information really quickly. So it went ahead and gave me this reading list of books and articles and courses and podcasts, which is great. Now I'm already in this space. I follow a lot of these things. So most of this was familiar to me. And one thing that stood out when I looked at the list was, oh, these are mostly old white guys. I know that to be a fact. And so I thought, these are sort of the typical who gets promoted in this space, who already has a lot of visibility. And because of that, there are also already things that I'm mostly familiar with or I have read. So I went back to it and I said, okay, that's a starting point, but I've already read some of these. And can you suggest ones that are created by women or people of color to see what I'm not seeing? Because there's not enough representation of women and people of color in this space. And I wanted to see, whose voices should I be adding into my library and learning from. So then I got suggestions based on that. And these are ones I haven't read. So that's great. I really want to dive in and find out more about these writers. So this is another example of how you need to be aware of the fact that the tool does have this bias that's baked in, that if you ask it for suggestions, it's probably going to suggest people who have a higher level of visibility on mainstream news, mainstream publications, which, as we know, is overrepresented for white males in most of these spaces, underrepresented for example, women, LGBTQ people, people of color. So that is something it helps to be aware of and know that you can actually ask ChatGPT to go further, or you can ask that in your initial prompt so that you can help to make sure that you are seeing a more diverse range of sources. Okay, that ended up going a little longer than I planned for today, but I hope it was helpful. And I look forward to hearing what more would you like to know about using ChatGPT in your work, overcoming some of the pitfalls, identifying and mitigating those risks, because it is a very powerful tool. There is a lot that we can do with it, but it does help to be informed and use it very intentionally.